2. So we are on air now. So welcome to Pax Europiana, the podcast about peace and prosperity in Europe. And I'm very honored to have a very special guest this morning. It's Mark Crawford, the American in Albania, and one American who decided to really reform and contribute to Albania for many years. You're now living there. You have been the chairman of the American Chamber of in Albania for many, many years. And you are also an investor yourself. You have also contributed to Albanian development. And you are also a very famous media personality in Albania due to your quite unique knowledge of Albanian language, which is also quite unique for an American. And also I met you, one of the first times I met you was when you were in Albanian television promoting during the 2012 election campaign Mitt Romney in Albanian live TV. That was quite extraordinary. I liked it very much because you're also one of the board members of Republicans Abroad. And in that functions, you were also in public television in Albania. I'm very honored that you take the time this morning to discuss with Pax Europiana about Albanian economic reform history. And I welcome you very much on the show. Please, Mark, introduce yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Gunter. Thank you for inviting me today. You're right. I've been in this region for quite a while. I first came to Albania in 1993 and then returned in 1996 to work with the Albanian American Enterprise Fund, which was an investment fund of about $30 million authorized by originally by this 1989 Congressional Seed Act from George Bush. However, we were the youngest and the smallest of the funds when I joined under President Clinton. And so we were involved with investing in what's now the airports in Albania, what was the original American Bank of Albania that's now in Intesa San Paulo, which is the TEG shopping area just outside of town, a number of insurance companies, and a number of projects that didn't work out as well. And then subsequent to that, I spent quite a bit of time in former Yugoslavia, almost 9 years in Montenegro, founding and building up a bank, which we sold to Erste Bank. So if you go to see Erste Bank in Montenegro, that was a bank that I was one of the founders and the CEO of, and then was involved in Serbia. But my wife is American, but she's from the Greek minority in Albania. And we came back to Albania about 10 years ago, more for our kids so that they could learn languages. My family doesn't speak anything other than English back in the United States. And my wife's family speaks Greek and Albanian. So the kids need to learn a couple of languages to get around, and I try to learn them as well. As you said, I'm currently the chairman emeritus and have been the former chairman both in Montenegro and in Albania of the American Chamber of Commerce, and had several terms there, and that got me on television, as well as my role as one of the vice presidents globally of Republicans overseas. We represent about 9 million American citizens that live abroad. An American citizen living abroad is taxed abroad and at home, but can also vote and can also get involved politically, giving funds if they so desire. So we get involved with some of those issues as well. And so I've also been investing mainly in the financial sector. I'm currently a shareholder and a founder of a bond agency corporation. We do broker-dealer work. However, we're focused more on fixed income at the moment and structured corporate debt, helping Albania develop that as one of their, let's say, new intermediary products that can help link opportunities to the excess funds that are in the market. So I am involved with that. I've also been involved with some unusual projects such as movies and natural resources. And so sometimes life takes you in a different direction. And I've enjoyed those most of the time.
Quite a unique experience, actually. And it started with this American Albanian Enterprise Fund. And that's something specific which the American taxpayers, the American state is doing for very friendly countries to invest in a state-funded venture capital instrument, which I think nobody else in the world does. And it's a very successful instrument. And maybe you can describe what exactly the achievement were and why America does this and why America supports Albania so much.
Well, this was a new initiative that came in 1989, as the title of the Congressional Act indicates. But George Bush Sr. basically saw the Iron Curtain coming down in the Eastern Bloc, and he knew that risk capital was important for the American entrepreneurial experience. And he also knew that the country risks of these Eastern Bloc countries was too high to attract normal risk investors from the West. So what they decided to do was to create these, let's say, venture funds that could do either debt or equity and make them country specific. And they would basically take some money that would have normally flowed through the USAID budget. So sometimes there was a little bit of tension between the USAID, which lost some money, and these enterprise funds. And then they created them for Poland, for Hungary, a couple for Russia, really for all of the Eastern Bloc, except for former Yugoslavia, because they were in armed conflict at the time. And in Albania, we were the youngest and the smallest at $30 million. I think when the fund ultimately wrapped up its mandated life, which was 15 years, we had a tenfold return on our capital. So, and currently it's a foundation. And I'm not sure the current assets under management, but I would guess it's probably between $300 and $400 million dollars, which is now going into let's say infrastructure or into education in Albania. But we were solely private sector focused at that time, and so we would start companies or lend to companies, and then we failed, but we were able to have some successes as well. And technically, I think statistically, we were the most successful of all of the funds. Some of them didn't have success. I think the Czech one lost 90 cents on the dollar. There were some ethics issues in some of the countries, or at least allegations. So it wasn't always a success. And then they fell out of favor a little bit in the United States. And so they didn't do any until more recently. They did one in Tunisia and in Egypt. And I believe those are going well. It's not too different than maybe what the European Investment Bank can do on a European-wide level, where they can help start funds. But this was very specific, where the Americans said, we're going to do everything. We're going to have a board of directors appointed by the President of the United States. So they're almost going to be at ambassador level in terms of seniority, although they're volunteer. And in Albania, I think one of the biggest risks that we've always seen is political risk. And so to come in with the weight of the White House, with a direct line to the Secretary of State, makes that fund very, very powerful. At least in Albania, that was our experience.
So can you describe a little bit the setting when you came first to Albania in 96, 97? It was very dramatic times. There was the end of the embargo to Yugoslavia, a lot of smuggling activities coming from tourists to Yugoslavia. There was also then the year 97, the breakdown of the institutions after the elections. And it was really the most dramatic years. Yeah? And then you came and you brought also, there was also this American effort to help and reconstruct and stabilize Albania. And can you describe your impressions? How was it for you when you came to Albania in 96?
Well, I still remember it very well. I remember going outside in the evening because I wanted to watch American sports. And the only way to watch American sports, because of the time difference, was to go to the American embassy. And there was one stoplight in Albania that I remember, and it didn't work. And that was my impression. No cars on the road, very few cars. It was very muddy, I remember. And so I remember a lot of electricity cuts, a lot of water cuts. I think Albania at that time had decided that it didn't want to be communist, but hadn't quite figured out what the free market was, and confused it oftentimes for anarchy. And that's what we saw in 97. I was in Albania during the pyramid scheme collapse, and evacuated myself to Turkey prior to when the American Marines had to come in and get, I think, the rest of the Americans and fly them out to a carrier in the Mediterranean. And then we as Americans were also impacted in 1998 when al-Nusra attacked the American embassy in Kenya and in Tanzania. And that was not as widely covered, although it's public information. But Albania was a potential target for attack at that time. And so the Americans, working although I didn't work for the US government, we were closely enough related because we had US government money. We were also evacuated, and I lived in Ohrid for 1 year, and we opened the American bank, let's say, remotely. So we've gone through a lot of stops and starts, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Albania has continued to progress, although sometimes it's hard to see it when you're living inside the country. But I think that now it's part of NATO. It's still making progress towards the European Union. The currency is relatively stable, so I think some good things have happened.
Absolutely, it's quite an amazing success story. But let me again talk about this. There was the Kosovo War then in 1999, and obviously Albania played a big role in that one. And it was a US-led operation for freedom in Kosovo. And how did it impact you? How did you see the situation on the ground in the crucial year of 89 and 99?
Well, I was in Macedonia and Albania, so I saw it from that side of the border. Naturally, we had a lot of refugees coming down, and so there was a lot of mobilization of the NGO community, which I was close to at the time, to try to help these people. I wasn't obviously involved with the military aspect of it, but more the humanitarian aspect, and trying to manage how can we continue to invest in this country, considering there's such difficulties. The Americans at the time were under restriction in Albania. When they let us come back to the country, they said that we couldn't go up to Shkodra and we couldn't go up to the northern areas because of the smuggling, because of some of the unrest. I decided at that time, I was a volunteer board member of a microcredit organization. I decided along with our board that we were going to go to Shkodra anyway. But in order to do so without causing problems with the Americans, I resigned my position as a direct employee of the fund. I created my own company in the United States and was hired by that company and signed a waiver. And I myself went to Shkodra and lived for a couple of months to set up what was called the Albanian Partner for Microcredit. I think it's now known as NOA in Albania, and no longer affiliated with the US government. But yeah, it was not easy, and we just had to make some difficult choices, sometimes some choices that people wouldn't normally have thought they would have had to make. But that was the reality of the world that we faced. Now it's quite different. You drive up to Shkodra, and then you maybe go into Montenegro and enjoy a nice fish dinner on the beach. But at that time, you were worried about getting stopped or robbed or having some problems with the unrest in the region.
That was kind of extraordinary times, and also thanks for your concrete and compassionate leadership and courage which you had in order to help the refugees, and also to start some microfinancing organization under that condition certainly was very difficult, and thanks a lot for that. Can you now describe from 2000 onward, Albania and the region has normalized? Kosovo was then under international administration, and there was also a massive effort to rebuild the whole region by the Europeans and the American partners. And can you describe this phase until 2005? How was it? Was there kind of a boom time? What was the challenges under this period?
Right. Well, I remember being in Skopje, Macedonia, and the fellow I was traveling with was Albanian, and our van had broken down. And so we wound up meeting someone in the repair shop, and he said that he was ethnically Albanian from Macedonia. He would drive us into Kosovo just after the war and take us to Jakova, where we were going to meet somebody, and then drive back to Tirana. And I remember that night very well, because in the middle of the night, the Orthodox Church in Jakova was bombed by the returning refugees, I think, in response to what had happened to them. And the drive back from Jakova to Tirana took probably eight hours or so. I couldn't remember. I just remember it was miserable. And now you can get to the border of Kosovo in 2 hours. So the investment and the infrastructure has changed dramatically. With the new Kosovo-Serbia agreement, there's hope that will continue to improve, not only between Kosovo and Albania, but between Albania all the way up to Budapest, which would of course include going through Serbia. So I think that the region being one at one time under Yugoslavia, I remember my Yugoslavian friends in Montenegro, they laughed. They said, well, we were all working together, and then we broke up. and now the internationals want to bring us back together again. But we already know what that means, and so we don't need someone from Ohio to come and tell us how to do that, because we know how to do that. It's just more of a matter of will, political will, I suppose. But we have seen that the trade routes have continued. I think the profit motive overcomes any ethnic division or historical problems. And so as they open up free trade, they open up possibilities for movement of ideas and movement of goods, and lower the barriers, whether it's taxes or other type of fiscal barriers, then I think you see a lot of more progress, and that's kind of what we want to continue to build on.
2004 was a very decisive year in European history, because it was the year when 7 countries were included in NATO, and also 10 countries joined the European Union. And it was very much the American president who was re-elected in 2004, George W. Bush. He very much promoted NATO enlargement, and he also invited then Croatia and Albania towards NATO in 2009. Can you a little bit describe this process of NATO accession of Albania, and how that was for you as an American living in Albania at that moment?
Yeah, in 2004, I was in Montenegro, actually. So I returned to Albania a little bit later. And I remember Montenegro wasn't quite ready for NATO at that time mentally. They are now a partner in NATO. But I remember at that time, they were still, I'll use the word disappointed with the fact that we we as NATO had gone against them in armed conflict. I was up there building a bank, and I saw the potential of where we are today, that they would be a part of NATO. But Albania itself, I think, has always been very pro-Western, and they tend to be very pro-American in my view. Maybe that's simply because Americans don't know really where Albania is, and we don't have any stigmatism against Albania that other Europeans might have. We know them as Europeans. We know them as related to John Belushi, which is a famous actor. We know them as related to famous singers and Mother Teresa, and any of the other kind of negative, let's say, suggestions that somebody in Italy or in Greece might have towards Albania. We don't really have that if you live in St. Louis, for example. So if you're in Albania and you come to America, the door is wide open for you. There's very little in terms of barriers, in terms of the stigmatism of being from Albania and treated the American than is normal for a country. I tend to think that a country should make its own decisions, but at times they certainly give the impression that they consult with the American embassy, and I would say the EU as well, for almost every major decision. And they don't like to take steps on their own or take initiatives without seeing someone else do it first. And with the NATO alliance, that's just something that draws them closer into a net that they feel comfortable with, to put them into a quilt. They are in Europe, obviously. They're surrounded by NATO. They're surrounded by the European Union. So it's a matter of time for that, let's say, quilt to be completed, and for Albania to be fully integrated. And Albania, I don't know if you were in a wartime situation somewhere and they said that the Albanian Air Force is going to come and save you, if anybody would be very comforted. But Albania does make a contribution, and it's usually a little bit maybe in unusual ways in support and logistics. They do actually send troops, and they are participating overseas, so that shouldn't be minimized. But they also get involved at that time, for example, they were taking some of the details, some of the from Iran. They almost from Obama and Biden, the chemical weapons from Syria, almost. But it's sometimes those kind of unusual contributions are the contributions that Albania makes.
So Albania as a NATO member, very important step. And it was in 2005 when Prime Minister Berisha was elected, and then started a very intensive phase of economic reform with low taxation and a lot of market opening and transformation of the, in a way, Europeanization of the Albanian economy. How did you experience this kind of reform drive of the years between 2005 and 2013?
I came in the still on the board of the microfinance at the time that I lived in Montenegro. So I would come back to the kind of since that period of time. So if you look at areas, you see that the seeds that period of time where there was an open, at least there was a chance for them to come in, and I believe they had a flat tax, and that made things easier. I don't know.
So the flat tax was one of the bigger achievements during these years. It was 10% flat tax. Was that positive for the investors?
Simplifying is just so ignoring the actual rate of 9%, 10%, 11%, or 5%. If it's then that the big, more or less.
Hi.
Brief Albanian pause.
Some technical issue, some glitch. No worries. Let me talk about, let me ask you about this tax reform and also the Berisha reform years. Yeah, there was a big dynamic here, and there was some progress for investment as well, big infrastructure project. What's your take on this period from 2005 to 2013? Was it dynamic? Was there progress? What was the major achievements?
Yes, it was dynamic. I think partly Albania needs to go out and be present, and physically present, and make the case that people should come and invest in Albania. I wouldn't think that Albania would be the top of the list for foreign investors to find on their own. But once they find Albania, a lot of them do like it. So I'll just take an example. I was in New York City with one of the members, a former member of the current administration, and we were having a breakfast with potential investors in Albania. And I had arranged this. They had even paid for it, and we had bigger names like Morgan Stanley Investment Bank, some other investment funds, and myself. I was there early, and so we waited, and we received a call from. About 30 minutes late after the event was supposed to start, we received a call from the now former administration official saying that he was not going to come to the breakfast. And so no one made an appearance for the government of Albania to tell Morgan Stanley that it's a good place to invest. And I, of course, know the material, so I gave the speech on behalf of the Albanian government, but I'm not Albanian. So I think we haven't seen Morgan Stanley or any of those people that were in that room come to invest here, and I don't think we will, because I think that they felt like they're not even important enough to have a breakfast with with somebody. And these are multi-billion-dollar groups, and they invest in the region. So if Albania is not showing up, then they're not going to get the investment. So show up. That's my first advice. The second advice is, when you show up, you need to have a story to tell. And if you're going to tell the story that we're the least competitive tax regime in the region, then somebody may say, well, I like the Balkans, but I'll go to Kosovo and I'll set up there where they have a zero dividend tax, or some simplified scenario, or Macedonia or Montenegro, and I can still cover Albania from those areas. I think a lot of people will just go to Serbia and cover the whole region from there, ignoring all of the historical or ethnic divisions, but just driven basically on the size of the market. So whatever Albania can do to simplify its tax code, to make it easier, to reduce barriers, to reduce political risk, they have to do that, because they're going to lose. Well, they're already losing to the rest of the world. So if they don't do that, they'll just lose to their neighbors. So that's something that I think has become more apparent over the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years. But prior to that, the administration, I don't know if they completely understood, but they at least took the positive steps of saying, we're going to have a simplified tax system. We are going to at least show up and say, hi, we're here, we exist. Because if you don't show up, then nobody's going to come to visit you. So I see some very simple, basic mistakes that Albania has made. Some of those can be corrected, but it's hard. You can't make a second first impression. So if the first impression is that these guys don't show up, and they're a small market and they're complicated, and then okay, then maybe they don't want us there. Let's go to Bulgaria, or let's go to Romania with 40 million people if we want to be in the Balkans. So those are some of the things that I think the Berisha government at that time did right, maybe by accident, but I think that's something that should be considered by whatever the next administration is. We have elections coming up later this month, to continue to simplify things, continue to show up. Sometimes I see these governments, they show up and they already have a pre-planned project that they want you to invest in. And they say, well, great, it's Morgan Stanley. Will you give us $100 million for a small road to Peshkopia, which is in the middle of Eastern Albania, and where this is a very nice place. I've been there, but no one commercially will tend to go there as a first stop. And so these investors are thinking, well, that's kind of a strange request to come to me and give me a package of options. And these limited options are not really very commercial. What I think they should do instead is just create a general environment and say, come to Albania. We've got good people. We've got good weather. We've got good taxes. And we make it simple for you. And then we don't know what you want to do. You decide that. You know your business better than we do. But you come, and we've got these people that have studied in various sectors that can help you out. We've got these international organizations, whether it's the accounting firms or the chambers of commerce, that can help you. And then you find your market. And we as a government will not tell you what to do or tell you where to invest exactly, but we will create a simplified environment so that you can find where your niche investment is more easily and have success within that. So hopefully we'll get less intervention from the government, more simplicity, and more success, as we've seen in the past. I wouldn't even say that back in 2000, let's say 10, things were perfect. We're just comparing the relative success that period to now, which things have not been very good for foreign investors in Albania.
So compared to the neighboring countries, Montenegro in the north, Kosovo in the northeast, and Macedonia, who all have 10% flat tax or 9% flat tax, it's one of the issues in Albania that there is a higher tax since 2014. The other issue is also the currency, because Kosovo and Montenegro use the euro, and Macedonia has currency stability with a pegged currency to the euro. Albania still has a flexible currency, one of the last countries in Eastern Europe. What's your take on that? Do you recommend a peg to the dollar? Do you recommend this flexible regime as it is now? Or would you argue for Euroization of Albania?
Well, I think we know what will eventually happen. It will be Euroization of Albania. And the euro and other foreign currencies are used. It is possible to denominate contracts in those currencies, and many people do. You can hold accounts in those currencies. There's a pretty free exchange of capital. So we know that the direction that Albania is going is in that direction. How quickly they can move to either a currency board backed by pegged to the euro, like Bosnia has done years ago, or something similar, I don't know. The currency generally has been, it hasn't had major, let's say, inflation fluctuations, but it is artificially managed, I think, by a few of the major exporters. And you can see the fluctuations during certain times of the year, which, ultimately that will go away, I think. And Albania will join. I'm not sure how quickly or that will happen. That the currency risk wasn't a major issue for foreign investors that I knew, because if they just didn't like the lek, they would just say, okay, we're going to denominate everything in euros in our contracts. And then they would just convert it back to whatever the lek exchange rate was at the time for taxation purposes. But I think that that's something that eventually is going to happen. It's just a matter of time.
One of the big issues in Albania and in all of the Balkans, obviously, is the issue of land access and transparency, property rights. Yeah, and especially in Albania, there is issues here, obviously, with the chaotic past. Do you see that now investment in land in Albania is safe? And was the progress like similar to Macedonia, where land rights are very secure? And what's your take on land reform in Albania?
One of my early investments when I was with the Albanian American Enterprise Fund was in real estate. That wasn't our primary focus. And so we would only do that as a secondary investment to protect basically another project that we had. And so we bought some land, and I remember that it was profitable, but it was very painful, because you would buy it and then somebody would come to you and say, well, I'm the real owner, or I'm the old owner, or I'm the third cousin of the owner, and I'm not on the papers, but I'm going to cause you problems. And you can still get those kind of problems in Albania. They don't have a digital land registry that's accessible easily online. Macedonia does. They don't want that. I think there's a lot of corruption and a lot of I'll just say money laundering that goes on in the real estate sector. There's still a lot of cash transactions occur. I would say that in some places, real estate prices are overinflated relative to rent prices. And it's a function of two things. I think one is partly a function of the informal economy, but it's also a function of the fact that there's not other alternatives for people to invest in, and there's not other intermediaries to, let's say, relieve some of this buildup of cash that people get. You buy a house if you're wealthy enough, you buy a car, and then if you have more money, you buy a second house. And if you buy more money, you buy a third house, and then you put some money in the bank and you buy a fourth house. So it's not like they readily go out and buy shares of Raiffeisen Bank, which is present in Albania, or buy Coca-Cola, which is present in Albania, or Pepsi, or Apple, which, people use Apple phones or computers. So it's not that Albanians have easy intermediary, let's say, access to companies and the economy that's actually operating in the country. And that's something that we've been trying to change over the last 10 years, I think, with limited success. But it's still something that needs to happen. But it all trickles back to the real estate. And so as far as that being the main outlet for wealth in terms of where you can invest, and in terms of the cash operations and the corruption issues, there's a real perverse incentive, I think, for people in power not to reform it. And they could have reformed it years ago if they wanted to. And I just suggested, and I think the World Bank initially got involved, but I'm not sure that they actually completed their project. But I said, you have a map of the country. Everybody has a map of the country. You know the basic plots of land because of the water company will have it, or the electricity company will have it, or something of that nature. So you kind of have, you know what the variables are. Why don't you just start with the state-owned land, the stuff that's not disputed, and just slowly fill in the map, and then let it fill in over time as there are no disputes. And wherever it's disputed or it's in courts, then mark it in a gray area or a shaded area. So potential investors, whether they're domestic or international, can just quickly look at the map and say, we like Albania, but we can see that, this part of the coastline is in dispute. So let's not waste time over there. We can go to the top of the mountain, and we know that that's not in dispute. And so at least you know that you can go there and start. There's apparently a bunch of land that the Albanian government will rent to you very cheaply. To actually find that map and to know where the land is that's potentially available is quite challenging. And I've been asking for it for months, and maybe I've just asked the wrong people. But I speak Albanian. I'm the former chairman of the American Chamber of Commerce, and I can't find the map. So I'm not sure you're going to find it if you're in London or in Germany. I think you physically have to go and meet somebody in the ministry, which, in fairness, I haven't done on that issue. It hasn't been super pressing, but this is something that I shouldn't have to think about. I should be able to go on the website, and the government will say, if you want to come here, here's the land, here's the price, and here's the contact information about how to apply for it. I haven't been able to find that, and that's government. So when you move to the private sector, where you've got historical generations that may be in dispute, or land that move back and forth between private sector and communism, or even in like my wife's village, our neighbor's house, I think the brothers have a dispute, so the house is in disrepair. So we haven't even gotten to those issues. We can't even figure out how to give people the $1 a square meter land to rent. So that to me is the basis of an economy, land and land rights, just about everything that I've seen in the West. Certainly when my family in America started their business, they took a loan against, I think, our personal house. So even though the business itself was in finance and had nothing to do with real estate, just the fact that there was underlying property backing up the loan just helped kickstart the business. So until that gets worked out, it's going to be very difficult for entrepreneurs to start up from nothing. A lot of people have value here, but it's locked up in real estate that's either unregistered or unclear. And so it's difficult to release that value in a productive way. And therefore the oligarchs get stronger, and the average people fall behind. So that's still, that was an issue that I raised when I was chairman. And it's an issue that's been raised to the highest levels of the government and the World Bank and the internationals. I don't know why at some point the World Bank or the Americans don't say, we're not going to do anything, and we're not going to give you any more money until you fix this basic thing. And it may be that the Americans helped mess it up in the beginning with some USAID advisors that gave them the wrong advice. I seem to remember somebody from USAID at one time telling them that they didn't need to digitalize the land registry. They could keep it in paper. But hopefully that's just hopefully that's just a memory that I misremember. But I think if the memory is accurate, then it wasn't just the Albanians, it was some of the early international advisors that probably set the wrong foundation in place.
It's especially worrying because in Macedonia that works very well, and in Montenegro the cadastre land register is also very transparent, and Albania has so much opportunity obviously in tourism and other sectors. And another thing which is also working in Macedonia and in Montenegro is a stock exchange, and that's
Yes.
also interesting because does Albania now have a stock exchange, and what is your take on the need for a stock exchange for Albania?
It does have a stock exchange. It's owned in part by the group that has MoneyGram here, and in part by Credence Bank, which is a large locally owned bank, and in part by the American Bank of Investments, which is separate to the American bank I mentioned earlier, but is also an American-owned bank. And at the moment, they have all of the regulations in place. They have the technology in place. I think they are trading treasury bills. And we're still waiting for our first listing of any private bonds or private equity. In my company, we have the possibility to do brokerage. And I kind of described the situation as we're all in the football stadium. The fans are there, ready to see the game. The players are on the field. The referees are waiting. The rules are in place, and someone forgot to bring the football. So we're all ready to go, but there's nothing to kick around. so we don't have anything listed. There's nothing listed. And in Montenegro, and I lived there during the time that they had 2 stock exchanges, the government was proactive in listing some of their old state assets. And some of those assets and some of those companies were horrible companies, but there was underlying value in the land. They were basically ghost companies, but that's one way to get something moving. And I mean, they were basically penny stocks, and typically they would kind of go up, and then crash, and then kind of normalize. And that's what they've done now. And I think that they're now seeing lower amounts of volume and lower amounts of actual like new listings. And so there will probably be consolidation. And I suggested that maybe they start off with consolidation, but so far nothing has progressed. I think there are a number of companies that could be listed. They could do a tracking amount of the water company, utilities, some of the private banks. I had investors from Chicago that they said, well, we've invested in Montenegro, we've invested in Macedonia, we've invested in Africa and all over the world. Let's try Albania. Give me the top utility and the top bank, and we'll just buy a couple of shares and see what happens and see where we go. Well, I told them they have to get on a plane and fly over to Albania and have to negotiate with the mayor, because there's no chance that they can buy a tracking amount of shares sitting in Chicago. So that if you make it difficult for investors to invest, they'll just go elsewhere. And so, I mean, they're investing in Iraq and places that were war-torn areas, but Albania is somehow it's at this point it's a conscious decision that they've just decided not to do that. But I still think it can be done. I still think that they could ask for every company that was involved with every domestic company anyway, involved with these concessions or these public-private placements to list something on the market, to give some transparency to what's going on. I think there's a number of companies that probably will need to be restructured now because of the COVID crisis, and possibly some kind of at least fixed income bonds or something of that could be developed. And so I think that's a big area of need, just generally financial intermediation. Right now it's just banks, and they're just taking money and lending money, very basic, nothing special, which is fine. That's an important part of the economy. But there's a lot of liquidity. Some of that is in the banks and it's being placed abroad at negative interest rates. So there's money there. We don't need credit guarantees. We don't need new loan programs from the Americans or from the Europeans. What we need is risk capital to come in with maybe some new equity funds. But we also need to encourage the local government to take some steps to basically energize the average citizen. They're watching as the economy is passing them by, they have no opportunity to participate.
In Austria, the Austrian state company Verbund, and they have also invested in Albania, but the way it was done, the privatization was only partially, like 49% was going to the Austrian stock exchange to also have more transparency. Do you think it's a possibility for the Albanian state energy giant, Cash, to also go with 25% or 30% on the Albanian stock exchange to kickstart some capital market in Albania?
Yes, I think they should do that. I think Kesh is one of them. I think some of the public transport, public utilities, I think the ports is something that they could probably list partially. Whatever concessions they have with mainly in the natural resources area. I don't think there's any Western drills turning in Albania at the moment. So there may be some Turkish investors, there may be some Chinese investors, but there's nothing coming from the West, which is strange considering the West is usually leading in this area and Albania is in Europe. So it kind of suggests that there's something asymmetric going on. In my experience, that sector has often been one of the most corrupt and complicated. Either shutting it down in some way or moving it over towards some transparency through the stock exchange might have a positive impact. I think that there's a lot that can be done, even with bonds and structured instruments. I think Albanians struggle sometimes to understand risk, and they struggle to understand let's say, an uncertain returns. But if you tell them that if you give me, $1,000 and you're going to get 5% at the end of the year, they understand that's fine. And if they understand that bond is attached to the port authority and that's getting revenue from that, then that makes sense, or the water company. So I think it's doable. They just need to start working with something, and following the Austrian model, I think is a good first step.
Let me discuss also the question of, and ask you about the question of energy. When you first came into Albania in the 90s, how was the situation of energy? How is it developed? And can you describe the energy potential and the progress in Albania in the last years?
Yeah. I think there's two different elements. One is energy production and exports, which sometimes I hear Albania produces a lot of energy and then they export it when the price is low, and then somehow they re-import energy at a high price, which seems like there's some kind of a game going on there behind the scenes. And then when you go down to the villages and some of the areas of Albania, you still get power cuts. I live in the center of the city, and right now our electricity has been quite fine. I remember when I was first in Albania in the 90s, the electricity would go off almost every day for hours and hours. I remember reheating my food by candle because there was no electricity. So certainly things have improved, I will say that. But it's still kind of a strange environment. I know Statkraft from Norway is here, and I think they've had success. They also have an agreement where I think they're able to take what they produce, at least the portion that goes to them, and export it through their network, which is quite well developed, and so it works well for them. A lot of these smaller, let's say, hydropower or even other natural resource things have not. Some have been built, but some have not been, and it's a common game for people in the ministry to take a license and basically you put it, let's say put it in the bank, but it's not really a bank. You just put it on ice, or you freeze it for yourself or with your friends, and then they try to resell it. So it's kind of a soft privatization through friends and family. So those areas still need to be cleaned up. There's talk about some of the rivers turning them into national parks, which is also an important consideration. So there's still issues that need to be dealt with. I think that there is a huge, and whatever progress is being made is going into the pockets of the well-connected, and the poor and the poorly connected are completely out of the growth in the economy.
Albania is also a major petrol producer, not like Saudi Arabia, obviously, but it has significant reserves of petrol in the south of Albania. And there was also many issues with compliance. There was this issue of privatization of Alpetrol. Maybe you can share your take on the petrol industry and what's the potential for Albania in the future.
Well, I believe that Albania may have the largest onshore reserves in Europe, or certainly in the region. I know Shell is actively working in the Berat area, and they've identified an enormous amount of petroleum. The difficulty is not identifying if it exists, but to actually be able to extract it in a cost-effective way. So there is oil here. It's Alpetrol, in my view. I'm not a huge fan of Alpetrol. I think that it's a legacy of a communist era. I think it's used by the ruling parties, whoever they are, to employ a couple of thousand people who probably don't need to be there. I think a lot of this is it's farmed out to friends and family of the insiders. Some of it's smuggled. Some of it's exported and re-imported, and not well refined. The actual refinery in Albania worked well because at the time, or I don't know if it worked well, but it worked because all of the fields were integrated. And so now you've got the big fields, which were under Bankers Petroleum, and then you've got some of the smaller fields, which used to be under a group called Transatlantic, and the smaller fields would be able to dilute the oil coming out of the bigger fields, and then you had a couple of other adjacent fields. And so as it was all interconnected, it could work, and you could refine it. Now it's much more complicated. It's probably the most difficult sector that I've seen in the country in terms of really in terms of everything. And I haven't recommended that foreigners invest in that area. I've seen very serious American billionaires come and look to invest in that area with full support of the US Embassy and full support of Washington, D.C. And within a matter of months, not years, but months, they basically got all their money stolen from them. And so, you know, and if Albania wants to tell people, or any country wants to tell people, hey, this sector is not for you, that's fine. That's their country. It's Albania's country. They can say, we don't want foreigners to invest in daycares. Okay, that's up to them. But at least tell us that before we come and invest in daycares. And so I've always felt that there are some sectors that are kind of like that, where they let foreigners come in to some degree to kind of provide an umbrella of activity, but underneath it's really messy and really nasty, and they don't really want the foreigners there anyway. And then they give them artificial fines, and then everybody winds up in arbitration, and then it's just it's dysfunctional. And the real concern is once you see that happening, it's not done in secret, because a lot of these companies are internationals. They have shareholders. They have to disclose this. And then soon you get a reputation that if you go and invest in anything significant in Albania, certainly over this present administration, that you're going to wind up in arbitration. Yeah, I've talked to the American embassy, and wherever they're able to come alongside an investor, if it's with the Exim Bank or with the old OPIC, the current Development Finance Corporation, then I think that it mitigates some of the political risk. But if they just come in, let's say naked as a normal investor, there was a period of time, although the embassy will probably deny it, but they were telling people not to come. Under this administration, I think that's hopefully changed. But it was just, the political risk was just too great in that sector, especially the petroleum sector.
About gas, there is now the Trans-Adriatic pipeline ready, which is a game-changing project for transport from Azeri gas towards Italy via Albania. Do you think there will be also significant transformation in terms of Albanian energy sector with this project, or is it only a transport project?
As I understand, it's only a transport project. It probably should be more, but it's not, from what I understand.
About mining opportunities, because there is also surprisingly quite a lot of mining stuff in Albania, especially chrome, but also other materials. What do you think about there? Is this potential already lifted, or is there more to come?
As I said, there are no Western drills turning in the mine area that I'm aware of. I know the Canadians came in several times. One specific case that I'm well aware of, they came in, they did identify some assets that they wanted to exploit. And just before they were able to exploit the assets, the government at that time basically sold their rights to some suspicious investors, and they lost tens of millions of dollars. So the experience was not good. I might need to plug my phone in. I think
it was working fine up to now. It's fine, I think, yeah.
Might be. So I may need to plug it in. One moment, let me see if I can plug in the.
You need some electricity. Yeah, that's an important topic. Yeah.
Yes. One moment, let me see if I can.
Absolutely.
Hopefully.
Very good. So let me ask you about the infrastructure sector, because in 2005 to 2013, there was a major drive to build highways, and Albania has now a modern airport, and also to renovate the Dure seaport. So what is your take on the infrastructure situation? How well is Albania connected to Greece, to Montenegro, Kosovo, Macedonia, and how is the logistic situation for foreign investors in Albania today?
I would say that to Montenegro and to Kosovo and to a lesser extent Greece and Italy, things are good. To Macedonia, it's improved, but not great. I went to Skopje a couple of years ago on a
Now it's not so good at the moment. The connection is not perfect at the moment.
I still see you, but maybe.
Now it's better.
Yeah, okay. Is that better?
Yes, very good.
Okay, good. So I was saying, I went to Skopje to meet with the Prime Minister Zaev, and it took me about 5 hours, and I think I got car sick on the way. And so I told him, you've got 30% of your population that's ethnically Albanian, and it's very difficult to get here. So I think there's a lot of trade that's going on, and it's probably off the books. It's certainly improved from when I first came to the region, but I think that most of the traffic goes through Kosovo, actually, on the Kosovo highway. So it's still a little bit difficult to go directly there, and so there's some work that can be improved. What I'd like to see is a train system that connects Albania to the rest of Europe. This, at least for transportation of goods. I think people probably just drive, but at least transportation of some of the heavy industry goods would benefit from a train system. And that's one thing that was mentioned in the Kosovo-Serbia agreement that was signed with President Trump in the White House.
Yeah, let's talk about that. What was your take on that? It was a major achievement that Israel has recognized Kosovo, and you also contributed to that. Can you describe some of the successful participation, if I may say so, or that it was really historic things which happened?
Well, I don't have any Jewish or Israeli heritage or Albanian heritage, but I wound up meeting some guys here in Albania who invited me to go to Israel about 3 years ago. And while there, I wound up meeting some former congressmen from the United States and met with some Israeli parliamentarians. And there was a real interest in improving relations between Albanians and Israel, specifically Jerusalem, where their parliament is based. I suggested to them that maybe Albania itself was not the place to focus because Albania already has good relations. For those that don't know, I think it's documented that during the war, the Israeli population increased in this area, so the Albanians and the Israelis have good relations. But the Albanians said we have no interest in moving our embassy to Jerusalem. We will vote against what the Americans are doing. And so what we're doing now is fine, but there's no interest in taking it further, at least diplomatically. That was the feedback that I was seeing. However, Kosovo was quite interested, and they seem to be more practical on the issue. They want people to recognize them, and Israel wanted someone to recognize Jerusalem. And so there was a historical positive relationship. The Prime Minister Thaci went on television, and he, at his own initiative, said that if Israel would recognize Kosovo, then Kosovo would open up an embassy in Jerusalem. That was on international television. He said it in Albanian. Subsequent to that, there was a private group. We didn't represent the government of the United States or Israel, but we went just to kind of explore what the possibilities were to create a chamber of commerce, basically a Kosovo chamber of commerce in Jerusalem. And that was well received by then Prime Minister Haradinaj and Foreign Minister Pazzoli. Subsequent to that, some friends of mine, because I'm the vice president of Republicans overseas, there was somehow some interest from Ambassador Grinnell, who was the American ambassador in Germany, to get involved. And so it seemed almost from the outside like we had too many cooks in the kitchen, because we had an ambassador in Kosovo, we had a special envoy, which I think was Mr. Palmer, and then we had Mr. Grinnell coming out on top of that. So as sometimes in the Trump administration, it seemed to happen, you get a few smart people and you kind of mix them all up. And sometimes it looks a bit chaotic, but occasionally something good comes out of it. I think that this is one of those times where it may have looked chaotic, but something good did come out of it. Serbia, of course, was not ready at that stage to do anything diplomatically, recognize Kosovo, but Israel was open to the idea, but cautious about what maybe Russia or Serbia or Syria might think. And as those issues were discussed, which I was not a part of those discussions behind closed doors, it became apparent that there could be some economic steps forward, which I think was in line with what I had done in my trip there regarding the potential for a chamber of commerce. And I'm a business guy, and I'll let the diplomats figure out how they want to refer to each other. I'm interested for people to exchange ideas and goods, whether they actually call each other separate countries or they like each other or not. I'm not always involved with that, but I can influence the movement of actual ideas and people, and that's really where relationships are built, not in Brussels or in Washington D.C. And so that's what we were focused on. And as we went down that path, Trump, being a businessman, said, this is good. Let's do this. Let's do what we can do, and not do nothing because we can't do everything. I think under the previous administration, we had a lot of support, and I think under the current American administration from President Obama and current President Biden, I think there's a lot of love and a lot of support for this region. But the more traditional approach is let's get everything in place. Let's get everybody to sign, binding commitments that we recognize each other before we do anything more. Trump was a little bit less diplomatic, less conventional. But in this case, I think it was still effective because he said, let's open up the corridor for the economy. And that's what they did with Serbia, Kosovo. Now, within that context, the door was open for diplomatic relations with Israel as well, and so that got put in on top of it, and Kosovo has continued to follow through with that. And I attended the signing with former Prime Minister Hoti a month ago. And then current Prime Minister Kurti has continued on with that commitment and opened up an embassy in Jerusalem, I believe, 2 weeks ago. So the more peace and diplomatic relations that we can help foster, the better. Ultimately, we want to see those diplomatic relations translated into good economic ties. If you can do the economic ties without the diplomatic relations, it's a little unusual, but Trump does that too. So I'm not totally surprised that the Serbia-Kosovo deal was an economic one, because maybe the diplomatic relations aren't quite ready. Just as an example, I have some Native American heritage, and somebody in Kosovo said, well, I will never support a deal with Serbia until they apologize. And I said, well, do you know when the American Congress apologized for whatever happened to the Native Americans? They apologized probably 200 years after the incidents happened. So I think that's an important part of the conversation. It's an important thing that needs to be done at some point. When that will be, I don't know. The American experience is that sometimes it's 200 years after the fact. But that didn't stop, obviously, my ancestors from doing business together and intermarrying, because here I am. So I think that's just the practical realities of the world.
That was a historic achievement, this Israel and Kosovo recognition, and quite amazing, actually, absolutely. So let me ask you also the economic consequences, because there was a major economic package also agreed during the Washington agreements of 2020. And so the one big project for Albania was this major hydropower project in the northeast. It's along the Drin River, which is the major river of Albania, and it's called Skavica. And this is, of course, huge. And do you think this will materialize now? And what's the time frame for that? And what's your take on that?
So it is progressing from what I'm aware of. I'm not in the center of all of these projects. I was probably more active with the Trump administration as a private sector participant in the working group. With the Biden administration, we believe that these projects still fall in line with their general policy views. I don't think there's much controversy between the American parties. However, because of the change of administration, the people that were working on it on a day-to-day basis and pushing things forward are no longer there. And so it'll take a little bit of time, sometimes 6 months or a year, before the new people come in. And we're hoping that the policy changes don't shift, but if they shift, then anything can happen. But what I do know is that that Bechtel, the American company out of California, the building company, which did the Hoover Dam, is interested and has expressed that they want to go forward with doing the building, and they are preparing the engineering plans. The Albanian government I think, has approved negotiations with them, pending, I think, those ultimate plans. My interest personally is mobilizing private capital. As I mentioned earlier in the interview, there's plenty of private capital that's interested to jump in to some kind of a structured debt deal on the back of some American capital that would absorb some of the political risk and maybe some of the commercial risk. And so there was just discussion about how that'll come together. I think ultimately it will need to involve some private capital, because the American government isn't in the business of using American taxpayer money or quasi-taxpayer money to crowd out the local investors. And we really want Albanians to ultimately be able to participate in their own economy. Otherwise, they're just going to see a nice dam. They're going to read on paper that somewhere the electricity is, better, but it didn't get to my house. and the people that live in that area, some will be displaced. So unless you're involving them in the actual economic positives of it, they're only going to see the negatives, and everything else is going to be theoretical to them. So that's my focus and my concern. But I think as a project, it's a project that was developed back under Enver Hoxha's time. It's a major project, one of the bigger ones for the region, if not the biggest. And I think it falls within the green energy initiative that would be compliant with both what President Biden wants to do in the European Union. So I think that's one project it's a very good one. There's another one that Exxon just recently signed onto. That they're going to come and look at a thermoelectric plant in Vlora and see if they can convert that to liquefied natural gas. LNG is a strategic priority of the United States at the moment. Certainly was under Trump, and I think it will need to be under Biden. There is a wing of the Democratic Party which wants to stop all gas and all fracking and all things of that nature, but I don't think the practical realities of the economy lend itself to stopping and starting abruptly. So with that in mind, I think that it will remain strategic. I joked that I think Exxon is only committed to come spend the summer on the beach in Vlora. So whether this project actually materializes after the feasibility study is done, we'll see. But I think there's some optimism that something good can come out of that. If that happens, I think the work was scheduled, according to the press release, in 2023. So it's not something that's going to happen tomorrow. It'll happen a couple of years later. But this is something. These things came out of the Trump administration and the renewed interest in this region. Normally, the Americans have not been interested in this region because I think only Kosovo of the Western Balkan countries falls within their category of eligibility for assistance. Every other country is a mid-level country. I think only Kosovo is a lower level country. And so because of that, if there's not a specific political interest, the Americans won't show up very much in terms of investment and aid from the US government side, if you're trying to mobilize OPEC or DFC and Exim Bank. So that was an important thing that Trump did. And we believe that Biden will continue that, but we're not completely sure yet.
There was also the talk about the railway project between Kosovo and Albania as part of the Washington Agreement, and also leading to a deep sea port at the Adriatic. So let me ask you, what's your take on the railway? Will it materialize? What's the economic benefit? And also, where should be the best location for the deep sea port? Will it be in Bar, Montenegro, in Durrës, in between? Will there be a new port? And what's your perspective on this major infrastructure project?
It is briefly mentioned in the agreement, just that access from Niš all the way to Kosovo to the Adriatic should be studied. I think it's just simply said that. It doesn't say if it should go through Albania or through Montenegro or how it should be built. The shortest route, I think, is through Albania, but that would require a new port and a new railway. There is an existing railway, of course, from Bar or T-Bar, the port in Montenegro, which goes up to connect towards Niš, I think. I don't believe it goes into Kosovo from there, or at least not directly. But those are things that I think are important, especially to refurbish or make a new railway. The port, I think, is mainly driven by the technicalities. Is it deep enough? I mean, if you look at the port of Durrës, the port of Durrës is not very deep. It's not deep enough for a major industrial port. So there are parts of Vlora that you could look at, but it's probably a little bit further away than what you'd really want. And so you probably would be looking not at Shenzhen, which is in the Malaysia area, but a little bit north. And if you're going to do a new port, that's where the natural depth is. I think it makes sense, and it's been mentioned by this administration in Albania that Durrës really should be a tourist type of yacht port. How they're going to figure out moving the industrial part and the commercial part over to either Porto Romano, which is a little bit north or elsewhere, and dredging that out, I think is possible, but it seems like digging in the sand on the beach. It just kind of fills back in, and it's not ideal. And so whether that ultimately happens, some of the folks that are closer to that are more expert in that area have said that the idea of a tourist port in Durrës makes sense. The idea of moving the port to where they want to move it, the industrial wise, it probably will fail. The Americans, I think, are interested to see what they can do, and they would like to be involved. I think there'll be a lot of potential for private sector investment. And at this stage, it's really so early stage that nobody is able to identify the area to do even the feasibility study, because the land is not, again, going back to the land, it's not clear if the land is available. It's not clear that if it could be available, who do you talk to? You're talking about, pipelines just like the tap gas pipeline that's going to cross the country. So you're going to have to be dealing with that kind of level of investment. I think with Trump, they might have pushed it a little bit further, at least to look into it. With Biden, I just don't know yet. And the default is you just put it in Montenegro and you just make it smaller, which if they're just politicians looking to check a bureaucratic box, then that's probably what they'll default to, which means that basically Albania is going to be excluded or very peripheral to that. So, but it's yet to see. I haven't seen that the American bureaucracy is going to move on this very quickly at all until the Biden administration is a little bit more settled.
Let me ask you about President Biden, because he is probably the American politician and in fact also the global politician who knows the Balkan best. He was very deeply involved in peacemaking in Bosnia, very deeply involved in Kosovo liberation, and he knows all the countries very detailed. I don't know if he was in Albania personally, but can you share what is your expectation? Will he also focus on the Balkans, or will he be busy in America with all these current crises to match? There are plenty of them, but will he take time for the Balkans? What's your take?
Well, he has 50 years of experience, so he knows the Balkans, he knows the world. He was one of the senior members of the Senate and the Foreign Relations Committee. So I think normally you want the president to know where you are and something about you. I think this president, he knows the world. I don't know if Albania or if Kosovo or the region has an advantage over other parts of the world, because he also knows other parts as well. The initial feedback from Secretary Blinken was they like what Trump has done in this region and they'd like to continue to push that forward. That being the case, the people that were in those positions that were implementing are no longer there and they have not been replaced. So in terms of the public press releases, that yes, we love you, and the store is empty, like no one's home, but we love you. And so I called them and I asked them, who do I talk to progress these or raise issues or concerns about crowding out private sector, or how do we mobilize this? And there's no one there yet. Obviously, we have our local embassies and we're in touch with those folks. And I have my friends back in Washington, but the folks that were kind of the bridge between them in those agencies, they're either not focused on it or they're not in place yet. I don't know that it's an issue for President Biden himself. He's got lots of problems with not just COVID and the border crisis, and re-implementing his own agenda, getting his own fiscal policies and other environmental policies in place. I think by the time he gets to to look back at Albania and Kosovo, it'll be probably the end of his first term. So if somebody comes to him and says, do you like them? He'll say, yes. We have a plan in place. It's moving forward. Should we stop it? He'll probably say, no, look, just continue because we like them and we don't have any concerns about them. And that's probably all we're going to get. That's all I expect to get, to be honest, from him. If you look at what he did in the Senate, he was very active in the region. But if you look at what he did when he was vice president, I don't remember him doing a whole lot other than sending a couple of nice letters and renaming one of the streets in Kosovo after his son, who passed away, which I think is nice. It's admirable. He came and paid a visit to the region. But in terms of actual concrete investment, we didn't see anything for those 8 years. So I don't know. I was a little concerned first that we'd lose momentum, which we're going to do because it's natural between any administration. I was not concerned that he would dislike the projects or the region and stop things, but I just don't. This is something that needs someone to push it. It needs somebody to say this is important, and not just say that we like you and we're not going to stop. But somebody to really push it. And Grinnell, Ambassador Grinnell, he was in some ways, I think, controversial because he was so pushy. But it was only because he was so pushy that we were able to get these deals done, and the Israeli deal on top of it. So he certainly broke eggs, and he may not have been the most popular person with every pundit that was watching him, but he was actually getting things done and pushing things forward. I don't see anybody pushing things forward at this stage, and that's my concern.
Do you think the US administration under President Biden will appoint a special envoy for the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue as well?
No.
So that's not a good answer.
Well, I think that they have a regional person, and they have the embassies. They'll work through the normal diplomatic channels, which is fine. That's what normal diplomatic channels are supposed to do. So if those ambassadors and the Deputy Secretary of State or the regional folks, if they're able to push it, then that's good. I don't expect anything special. No.
Peace in the Southern Balkan depends on American leadership. So it's very important to have a strong American leadership. I hope you personally will also be very active in the coming years to make sure that America is engaged in the Southern Balkans. Let me ask you about the EU role, because you as American in Albania, how to judge the last year since 2014, because then Albania got EU candidate status. That was a big achievement, but unfortunately the progress in terms of EU accession for Albania was limited. How do you see the contribution of the European Union? What's your hope? Do you see the region in the European Union in the coming years? And what's your take on European Albania?
Well, I think it's happening on its own. It'll happen organically, but that means it'll happen more slowly. So I suppose what are we suggesting that they should do to push things along? We need somebody to push things. Albania, when left to itself, will kind of float along the stream, and the current is taking it in the right direction, but it won't actually row or turn the engine on the boat to go faster. So it's more of a question, not where we will be, because we know eventually where we will be, but how fast we get to that objective. I think, just going back to the basics, go back to the land registry, to the online cadastre. Some of these things, they're not new ideas. They just need somebody to push it and just say that this is contingent on the next step of funding from us, or the next step of whatever liberalization they're going to do. These are things that I think the European Union can help with. Don't know who specifically would take the lead on that. If it's one of the individual member states, I tend to get the impression, and maybe it's a wrong impression, but that the EU as a body has influence, of course, in Albania, but it's really the individual member states that step forward and say, this is what we want, or we don't want. And that's what really makes change happen. I tend to see, this is maybe my perspective as an outsider, that the European Union as a unit just kind of creates a framework that you have to stay in, but doesn't always push the progress that you need to in order to get to that framework.
In 2009, Albania and Croatia joined NATO together. And in Croatia, it was possible for 2013 already to join the European Union. But unfortunately, there was a decade lost now in Albania in terms of EU accession. Now already we have Macedonia NATO member, Montenegro NATO member. So it's 3 NATO members here in the Southern Balkans. And they all want to join the European Union. And now it needs somebody to drive this process, you know, to really lead the debate. In the case of Croatia, this was Germany who really lifted Croatia into the European Union. Do you see any like Greece or Italy or maybe actually America to really take these 3 NATO allies at the hand and open the doors of the European Union for the 3 NATO allies?
I think they could, but I don't think they will. Beyond what is normally the normal progression that's happening now. I still think that there's some concerns that have been raised, maybe by the Dutch or someone else, that, you know, there's still a lot of informal economy in Albania. There's still a lot of organized crime that's connected to trafficking or drugs, and some of that's connected to politicians. So when you have those kind of concerns that some of your biggest let's say suspicious characters are actually members of parliament, then that's an allegation I think that needs to be dealt with before you can get any single country to say that, yes, I'm going to put my reputation on the line and push this forward. I don't remember those kind of allegations in Croatia when they were moving into the European Union. Maybe there were some domestic issues that came out in the local Croatian newspapers, and that stuff always happens. You'd see that in Albania, but some of the criticisms that you see about Albania and some of the issues that they're facing, those are internationally, let's say, recognized issues. So until those things are dealt with, or I mean, some of these things, some of these issues maybe are a question of different policy. I mean, maybe at least with some of the drug issues, you know, some legalizations or some decriminalizations, a different approach, considering that the current approach is not very effective.
In 2013, during the election campaign, when Prime Minister Rama was winning, and he's now in power the 2nd term already, and he's running again for the 3rd term now, he was, one of his platform was anti-corruption, anti-corruption. I remember it was their own website established, Anti-Corruptionit, and it was also in front of the Prime Minister's building, was a big anti-corruption monument erected. Yeah. So let me ask you, from the business perspective, from the investor's perspective, how is the progress in the last 8 years when it comes to anti-corruption?
I think it varies based on the sector. As I said, during the last 8 years in the natural resources and energy sector has probably been the most corrupt and the worst I've seen, but it may be also that I've been looking at that sector a little bit more closely because of some of the members of the Chamber of Commerce. So I think that's gone backwards. Some of the financial areas, financial sector, that seems to be more stable because I was involved with some of the banks. I think it's been a stop-start progress. I mean, this administration at one point was trying to increase its VAT revenues, and so they started to threaten people with fines or jail time if they didn't get a fiscal receipt, or if the waiter didn't bring the receipt for the coffee to the table, then the owner was going to be in trouble, the owner of the restaurant, and if the customer didn't take the receipt and walk away from the table and keep that receipt with him for a certain number of meters, then they could get in trouble. So, I mean, we went from that kind of a draconian attempted policy to now a policy where for other reasons. I mean, we have COVID, and we're probably one of the more open countries, I think, in the world in regards to that. And so it's been a wide range of variables in play, and it's not been one consistent environment, not always to the to blame the government, because some things were out of their control. I think the anti-corruption, let's say, platform is just a traditional one. I remember Berisha had his Clean Hands platform when he won, and then Rama had the anti-corruption platform when he ran. I think all we can draw from that is that corruption is still a major issue, because they both keep raising it, and the other party keeps winning by pointing out the first party's corruption. So, I mean, we've had shell companies in America started for roads that were built at 20 times, the average, cost of an EU road. And you've got certain oligarchs that are just, selling cigarettes on one side, and then they're providing the health services, the government health services on the other side. And to be honest, I'm friends, and some of these were members of the American Chamber. So I wouldn't say that these businesses were always with bad people doing bad things, but sometimes the government was enabling paradoxes. And so you really shouldn't have the health people and the people selling the nicotine in the same room, the same person. Not that person's a bad person, but you just need more of a checks and balances environment. And we haven't always had that in this government.
So what's your, now is election in Albania. I think in the 25th of April, there will be elections. What's your take? Yes. What are the most important, no matter who wins, but from the business investors, and as an American, as a friend of Albania, you really devoted 20 years of your life, 25 years of your life to this country. And what is your take? What are the most important projects really to be implemented in the first 100 days of a new Prime Minister of Albania in 2021?
Well, I'm sure there'll be some change even if the existing government stays in place. But the interesting thing in Albania is apparently, according to their constitution, whoever wins doesn't take power until September. So that's quite a few months from now. They have plenty of time to plan. And so if they don't have a platform, they can create one before they take power. I think in some ways in Albania, maybe it's not too different than my take on the American elections. It's not that they're voting for the opposition, it's that there may be a vote against the existing government if there was a change. I don't know that anybody hates or dislikes President Biden, but I don't know anybody that was really excited because of him either. It was more that we love and we hate President Trump, and I guess there was enough people that didn't like President Trump, so they got rid of him. And that's kind of been the case here in Albania that I've seen. It's usually the first mandate. The government's, pretty nice and tries to do good things. The second mandate, is ridiculous, like just mass corruption, regardless of who's in power. And then by the time the third mandate comes around, people are a little bit tired and they say, okay, let's have a change. And so maybe that's what we'll see here. I saw some polls that suggested that the Socialist Party was still maybe the leading vote getter, but not going to be able to form a government on its own, and possibly a coalition of opposition parties could be enough to form a government. Whether that actually happens or not, I'm not sure. But it may be just some fatigue with the current government, which I think is kind of a normal rotation. And maybe that's a positive thing in Albania, that there actually is rotation. We can see in some parts of the Balkans that there is no rotation, or almost no rotation. And so you have lots of stability, but if it's bad, if it's a bad environment, it's stably bad. So I mean, I've told all the parties that I'll try to help whoever wins. I'm not a voter in Albania, so I'll support whoever the people support. And sometimes I go to, let's say, the left-wing party, and I hear about how they're trying to deregulate and empower the small business. And then I go to the right-wing party, and they talk about how they want to give subsidies to everyone. So sometimes I think that the messages between the platforms of liberal, conservative are sometimes mixed, to where you're not quite sure which party is left and which party is right-wing. But simplifying the tax code, breaking down the barriers so that we're competitive with our neighbors. We may or may not be competitive with the Marshall Islands or the British, Virgin Islands, but at least we should be competitive with Macedonia and Kosovo and Montenegro. Getting somebody on the Albanian side to push for some of these projects. If we're waiting for President Biden all the time, then maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't. But get somebody on the Albanian side to push. Get somebody on the Albanian side to show up at these breakfasts and say, hey, we're here and we want to do this. And we've got some good ideas, and we've got some good people. We have a whole generation of Albanians that have never seen communism. They've been exposed to Western Europe, many of them. They've been exposed to North America, some to Asia. They've seen what the world can do and what the world can bring. We just need to tap into that. I think there's still a lot of, if it was me, I would probably close down some of the government agencies that exist. There was a famous debate where Governor Rick Perry from Texas, they asked him which 3 agencies he was going to cancel, and he could only remember 2 of the 3 that he said he was going to cancel. but the idea that maybe there's too much government and it's just too bureaucratic, I think is a real issue. In some ways, I think that Albania in some areas could move away from a progressive tax, and maybe even away from a flat tax, and just have 0 tax and just a fee. And just like for a small business, this should all be stuff online. You should never have somebody that knocks on your door and asks you if you're registered, because they should know if you are registered. They should know because you're in the electronic system. And if you pay just an annual fee, then they'll know that at this address there is a business with this name and this owner, and they've paid their fee, and I don't need to bother them. And I shouldn't be allowed to bother them, because the tax of time, the tax of just bureaucracy is one of the biggest taxes in these emerging markets, in Albania specifically. So if it was me, I would push hard on the financial intermediation, try to get some structured debt instruments, some municipal bonds, for example. I've suggested that Albania, specifically related to the municipalities where they've had problems like the earthquake, issue a bond from the municipality at a reduced rate, maybe even a 0 rate, if you're going to include like some sort of fiscal amnesty, and allow people to invest specifically into that bond. I don't think it's a good idea to bring untaxed money into the normal banking sector. But if you do decide that you're going to do a fiscal amnesty, force people to put that money into a 20-year bond, and then at a 0 coupon, so they're not getting anything. And that's the cost of avoiding the taxes or whatever they did. And then then let it trade, so it'll trade at a discount. So then you get the money in this. Honduras could use it for construction of the earthquake damage, or another municipality could do it for a hospital or a school or something specific. And you could use that model, a kind of a patriot bond, to mobilize money, to mobilize it cheaply, if not basically at no cost, and get the economy moving, but make it tradable, so that then you can get the average person involved, and you can get some trickle down effect I mean, when we're looking at Skavica, we've got let's say $500 million that's going to come in financing. If it comes in from Exim Bank, and it just comes in from Exim Bank, it's just going to come in one transfer. It's going to get, you know, or a tranche of transfers is going to get paid out to Bechtel. The Bechtel guys are going to take it back to California, and you're going to end up with a very nice dam. But if you do it through some sort of a bond mechanism, then all of a sudden you start to get the banks involved, you start to get the pension funds involved, you start to get the local investors involved, then you get trading, and then you create an environment that you can do the next hydropower project yourself, or with less participation. But if you do it just with Exim Bank, which was one suggestion, yeah, you can do it, but you'll have left nothing behind in terms of infrastructure for future economic development growth. And I think that the Europeans and the Americans are making big mistakes when they do that. They come in, they think they're doing the right thing, they're checking boxes, they're giving the money, but they've built up no capacity in the country for the country to do it on its own. And Albania hasn't really shown that they're able to develop it on their own, but once they do it once, they can repeat it. So it just needs somebody with a little bit of vision to help that along. So that's what I'd suggest.
For a transparent and fair capital market, European style, it would help to have the euro as a currency, like it is in Montenegro and Kosovo. And there is some talk to adopt the euro in Albania. And would you suggest, when the political integration might take more time, economic integration via adopting the euro, similar like in Montenegro and Kosovo, is a scenario which would help the financial markets to be more transparent?
I think it will, and it'll happen eventually. Equally, though, I know that there are some high-risk investors that they only invest in weaker currencies. And so I think Albania just needs to recognize where it is. Sometimes I tell Albania, the government guys, you look at America and you try to adopt our tax policy and you look at Manhattan. And I said, but you guys are not Manhattan. You guys are Las Vegas. So just go to Las Vegas because, you know, anything goes there. And it doesn't mean it doesn't work. Las Vegas works, you know, Nevada works, it gets revenue. It's just a little bit crazier. And so that's fine. You just need to adopt the system that matches you. And at this stage, Albania, I think even if they don't adopt the euro, they'll still attract a certain higher risk investor that will say, you know, I'm interested in the potential fluctuation of the currency of the lek relative to the euro, and I'll come in to that market because I can see some more upside there. These guys in Chicago that were interested, that I mentioned before, that were interested in investing in banks or utilities, they only invest in non-dollar, non-euro, non-Swiss franc countries because they see more potential growth there. So I do think that Albania will eventually get to the euro, but even if they make some of these steps in advance, they'll still attract a certain level of investor that they're not getting yet.
You mentioned some of the American states. Yeah? And the idea, when you look to Albania with its beautiful beaches and this beautiful landscape, the mountains and this amazing sand beaches, the logical comparison with America would be Florida. And also to my question, can Albania in 2030 be the Florida of Europe, where a lot of retirees from Northern Europe come to this beautiful country to settle down, to spend the winter there? And also, do you see a real strong tourism industry in the Florida of Europe in Albania 2030?
Yes, I see. I see that this is growing. It's you know, maybe like going down to the Mexican, the Baja California area, the little finger. It's not as nice as San Diego, but the weather's better. So so if you're coming from Canada, then you know you go down to Baja, Mexico, and I think Albania will be something like that. If it develops. Right now, they haven't shown that they can develop properly. Like let's say, it's more Atlantic coast Florida than the Gulf Coast. The Gulf Coast Florida is a little bit more orderly, more Midwesterners, and then the Atlantic coast I think was developed first, and it's a little bit more kind of mix and match. But I think it'll eventually happen. It just becomes more difficult with knocking down buildings and then re-erecting them. I think that again, it just goes back to the corruption of the coastal cities, and basically the mafia or political mafia just acts, with impunity. They don't care, and they still don't care. And it's not my focus, but I don't think it always impacts the foreign investor. But there have been cases where they do try to extort money from people and do threaten violence. So as long as that's going on, it's a tough situation. I think for the individual in Albania, it's a fantastic place. It's a safe place. It's a welcoming place. And so on the individual level, I think that will continue to grow, that kind of tourism.
In closing, let me also ask you personally, are you committed to stay in Albania? Will you continue your contribution to economic development of Albania, and where you see yourself in 20 years? In a beautiful beach house in Durres or in Flora or in one of the beautiful sandy beaches? Please.
Well, I'm American, and I intend to stay American. My family is Albanian American, but I'm not, and I go kind of according to my projects. I've got some projects in the United States, and I'm actively involved in politics there as well. So my mother-in-law is in Albania, so I'm certainly tied, I'm tied to here and coming back and forth. So I don't know where things will lead. I took some time and went to Montenegro. I've taken time out and gone to the United States to work on projects. It may be, we'll just see how the political scene looks like after this election. If there are some opportunities to pursue here now, then I'll do that. If there are not opportunities, then I may spend a little bit more time in the United States. But I think it's a situation of always splitting my time between this region and the United States. So that's I guess my future is a little bit fluid. But as an entrepreneur, you're always starting new projects and following new ideas, and some work out and some don't, and you kind of move geographically alongside them.
So you're not decided between Florida and Albania, but I think the audience is
very
much
hoping. My heritage is from the Republic of Texas before it became part of the United States.
That's also a beautiful place, and also oil industry.
So, although I guess most of my family came, aside from the Native American part, most of it came to the United States before the American Revolution. A portion of them wound up in Texas, the Republic of Texas, before I go to Florida.
So in the name of the old audience, many of them coming from Albania, Kosovo, and from the region, they want certainly that you, Mark Crawford, be very active in the coming decade to bring more American investment towards Albania and Kosovo and Macedonia to be very successful, and also to say thank you very much for all the things you did already for Albania and Kosovo in the last 20 years, 25 years of your engagement, also for Montenegro, also for Macedonia. This is a beautiful region, and you contributed a lot to improving it. Thanks a lot for that, and very much appreciated that you took time for this interview.
Good. Well, I look forward for you to come back to the region and to continue to work with you.
Definitely. Thanks a lot. I'm also looking forward. Here. I will come.
Great. Great.
And all the best for that, and success in the coming years for investment in the Southern Balkans. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
I will